presenter. I'm Christian Ostermann, Director of European Studies here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion with a member of the European Parliament, Georgos Dimitrakopoulos. We're delighted to host him here for a talk on European perspectives on the current state of transatlantic relations. Obviously, to this audience, I don't need to go into detail on the full and pressing agenda before the United States in Europe, obviously with the Euro crisis and Afghanistan at the top of the agenda, but with energy security issues and other issues crowding what is really a renewed, newly important agenda for this country, very much with potential to affect developments, both political and economic, on this side of the Atlantic. So it's wonderful to have Mr. Dimitrakopoulos here to give us an additional perspective, not just a Greek perspective, but a European perspective on these issues, and then to engage after the presentation into a conversation with all of you. Georgos Dimitrakopoulos has been a member of the European Parliament since 1994, where he served as member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, the Subcommittee on Security and Defense, as well as a rapporteur on the European Parliament for Iraq. From 2004 to the present, he has served as Vice President of the Temporary Committee on the Alleged Use of European Countries by the CIA for the transport and illegal detention of prisoners. Obviously, a highly charged, emotionally charged subject. From 1999 to 2004, he was the second vice president of the parliament, and from 94 to 99, also he was the first vice president of the Petitions Committee. Prior to that, he held various journalistic and teaching positions. He has published a good number of articles and books on various topics relating to the European Union, the war in Iraq, Mediterranean politics, and other issues. He just brought along most recent edited publication, A New Constitutional Settlement for the European People, that he might refer to in his presentation as well. He holds a number of degrees from a BA in public law and political science from the University of Athens to a master's degree in foreign affairs from American University, and postgraduate work, international law and diplomatic history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. It's wonderful to have him here. The center has long had a focus on explaining the European Union to Washington, to the American public, and no one is more qualified than Mr. Dimitrakopoulos as a member of Parliament and having served in so many distinguished positions there to help us further on this understanding. So with that, it's a great pleasure. You have the floor. It's on?
It's on. Well, good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank you, Christian Ostermann, for the invitation, the initiative, and all we went through to prepare this trip for me coming here. I would also thank my wife that is here, because she worked out with all the logistics and spent long hours in researching and going through the labyrinth of European Parliament documents just to update what I have to say. And I would also say that for me it's an honor, but it's also, if you wish, something sentimental to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, because it is here that I met the professor that took me from Washington, D.C. to Boston to the Fletcher School. It's Professor Alan Henriksen, who was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center when I was here, and I came here a couple of times to see him, and after that he moved back to the school and I went along. So obviously at this moment transatlantic relations are the key point, not only because of the points that Christian Osterman just made, the economy, politico-military issues around Afghanistan and Iraq, the changes and what is at stake and the evolution of these changes in the Euro-Mediterranean basin, which are quite important, and other issues that have to do with trade, cultural issues, and so on and so forth. There is, at the level of the European Union, a clear position, and I would say a consensus among the 28 member states, that transatlantic relations have to exist, be strengthened, and by being so, they constitute a tool not only of research, but also a tool of conduct in international relations. There have certainly been moments where the relationship between the two main partners, and that is the European Union on the one side and the United States of America on the other side, have been going through crises and tensions. And I wouldn't only refer to political issues. I remember that when I was Vice President of the Parliament, we had the question of Iraq, and that was a question that did not only cast a shadow on relations between the European Union and the United States, but it did create, I would say it as clearly as possible, a split between the European Union members. At that time, Greece had the presidency of the Union, and therefore, as you can imagine, it was quite a delicate and difficult moment in order to come down to what I would call common grounds, because everybody said, okay, there is a difference of opinion, but at the same time, we should not let things go to a complete breakdown of Euro-American relations. There are other areas where, at times, relations between the European Union and the United States have been going through difficulties. Those are basically areas of trade, where, just to give one example that I'm sure you all know, we always had the competing attitudes between the two giants in the airline industry, Airbus and Boeing. This is not only at the level of the European Union, of course, but it has been sometimes a conflict between the European Union and the United States at the level of the WTO, which is equally interesting. And of course, at certain moments we have had differences of opinion as regards the agricultural sector, which of course for the European Union is being a crucial issue due on the one hand to the enlargement process, that I will very quickly try to outline later, but also due to the fact that there are different ideas as to the content of the products and as to the financing of agricultural policies. Like, for example, the United States has been always very critical of the subsidies to exports of agricultural products, which has not always been the case for the European Union. Now, at this moment, you all know that if we had to, or at least if I had to characterize what is going on in the world, I would have said the world has changed, and the world is changing. And if we look around and we try to sort of codify what changed and changing means, we would see that in the international system we have important new developments at the political level, like what is happening in the Mediterranean basin, North Africa. We have new actors, and I would say that with a lot of respect for the United States, that has suffered from one of these new actors, and that is terrorism. But it's certainly one of the important new actors in the international system. Then I would say we have new conditions, and I am referring more without underestimating any others, but just to give an example, I'm referring more to environmental questions. And as you know very well, environmental issues are most of the times setting forth questions as regards, for instance, the readiness of states to be able to face the consequences. And I would also say health questions that are sort of broad issues at both the European level and the United States. And then, of course, we have some new trends. We said about the economy. I think the economy would be a never-ending subject. It's certainly not easy to confront the different facets that go underneath the title international economy. I think we are going through, just to give one example, we are going through an important reconsideration of the checks and balances in the international monetary system. And that is something that needs to be taken into consideration, because I think on the one hand we have the conceptual framework set forth by the dollar. On the other hand, we have the euro, but certainly if you look at the foundation of these two currencies to begin with, they are very different, more in terms of the fortifying and protection system that goes along with them, and the crisis, the recent crisis at the European level is perhaps a good example. And then you have the currencies of other emerging or emerged and emerging powers like China and to a certain extent Russia. Now, obviously, all these issues and the way these issues are approached by the European Union and the United States, which is what forms the core of transatlantic relations today, certainly raise a good question. And the good question is, if and since there is a consensus, and I think irrespective of particular worries and different approaches, there is a consensus on both sides. At least my experience and what I have lived through as a parliamentarian for so many years led me to that conclusion. There is therefore a consensus to continue with transatlantic relations. Is how do we go about doing that? And how do we go about doing that is a good question right now because of the new conditions that characterize the international system. So my first observation, and if you wish, my first proposition to this very interesting meeting would be that we need to strengthen transatlantic relations by restructuring them, and by restructuring them on a clear and global approach. This is something that I think is being debated to a certain extent here in the United States. It's certainly something that is discussed at the European level, not only in institutions, not only in committees, but also in universities, think tanks of the ones that exist in Brussels. Now, restructuring them. That needs a careful approach. In what sense? In the sense that if we look at the institutionalization of transatlantic relations, we would see that for a long period of time, and that was logical, transatlantic relations were centered or were moving around the so-called NATO system. Why? I think it's very simple. We grew up, at least I grew up, in a world that was bipolar, and the codification of bipolarity, among other things, was not only US, USSR at that time, it was NATO and Warsaw Pact. And it was logical at that time to see as a priority the questions of security and defense, and obviously NATO being one of the few, at the time the only organization where you had both European and American and Canadian representation, was perhaps the best body to serve, let's say, as the basis for transatlantic relations. Now, over the years, as you know very well, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, things have changed. I wouldn't say that became simpler, because they didn't, but they have changed, and the fact that we have, as I said a couple of minutes ago, new actors, new trends, new conditions in the international system ought to be taken or needs to be taken into consideration in the restructuring of transatlantic relations. I would therefore, and this is my second proposition to our meeting, I would therefore think of the restructuring of transatlantic relations on the basis, changing the basis, without underestimating the role of NATO, without underestimating the concept of security that is important. And I underline the word security because this is something that NATO itself is discussing right now. There are two terms that we are normally used to. One is defense, and that's been the doctrine all along, and the second is security. Now, security is broader than defense. It includes more issues, and it requires a different, to a certain extent, type of organization, in as much as it is a reality today. Now, I don't underestimate that. I think that is important. It has to be there. But to that, I would add sectors, and at least today I'll deal with one of them, that I think are equally important and are crucial. And my proposition, therefore, would be, my second proposition, would be to introduce energy, and by energy I say energy sufficiency and energy security, or security of energy sources, as one new field that would be important in this effort of restructuring and, to a certain extent, reconsidering the word taken in its good sense, the content and the logic and the philosophy of transatlantic relations. Here, of course, things get quite interesting. Energy for Europe, that doesn't mean that is not for the United States, but there are different characteristics, I think. Energy for Europe is a crucial question. And it's a crucial question for a number of reasons. One is that Europe is very dependent on external sources for its energy supplies. You may think that I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. The second point is that due to the importance of energy, the chapter of energy figures in all the important European Union policies. Let me outline three of them very briefly. One policy is the policy that you all know, and it's the policy of enlargement. Now, obviously, the European Union did not have to go through the notion that is very well known in American history, and that is the very famous phrase 54-40 fight, at the time that there was a dispute with the British over Oregon. But it certainly did have to go through a long process to become the Europe of 28 member states that's today. So the energy chapter is there for more than one reasons, and because when the European Union discusses energy, it talks about oil, natural gas as being more compatible with an environmental low-carbon strategy that the European Union wants, nuclear energy, and things with nuclear energy in Europe have been as, or to some extent, more controversial than they have been here. And this is because, first of all, in the existing or if you wish, in the member states that have had an experience with nuclear energy, and that's France and the United Kingdom first, but then also Germany and Spain, you had movements in the interior of those countries, and were basically the green parties that wanted to reduce and, in fact, even coerce and do away with nuclear energy policies of their governments. When you talk about the new member states, you had a number of member states that disposed of nuclear technology, but unfortunately that technology was coming from the old Soviet Union, so you were talking about reactors that were really in bad shape, and the rest of the European member states made it a point that they would not become members of the European Union unless they change or close down some of these reactors. That's one case is Bulgaria, and the second case is the Czech Republic with Kozloduy nuclear plant and Mochovce, respectively. The second policy where you have energy is the Euro-Mediterranean policy, which is the European Union policy with 7 countries of the Mediterranean basin. I'm speaking about 7 countries because the 8th country, which was Turkey, Turkey is a candidate state that has applied for membership to the European Union, so it went into a different sort of level of policy. And then, of course, the other important policy where the energy chapter is quite important is the European Neighbourhood policy, which is a policy that is directed mainly to the Caucasus region and the Ukraine. And as I was looking, because this has been a very difficult issue to treat, I'm speaking from the perspective of the European Union institutions. I saw even that there have been studies at some universities in the United States under the title The United States and the European Neighbourhood Policy, which I found that very interesting. And believe me, that would be something that I would encourage as an exercise, in the sense that the neighbourhood policy is not known yet as the Euro-Mediterranean policy or the enlargement policy are, but it does have many issues in areas that I think are quite important, like the Caucasus region. So that being the case, I would go back to what I think is an important characteristic, and that is the dependency issue. And at this particular moment, obviously the oil question over the years has been an issue that the European Union, as I said, for environmental reasons, was trying to not exactly downgrade, but at least to reduce its magnitude. Obviously, at this moment, the developments in North Africa and the Mediterranean area do create second thoughts. The best example was the case of Libya, where when the uprising started, the Union had to stop for some time getting oil from Libya. Now, of course, these things are subject to the evolution of diplomacy. Then you have, as regards oil, the case of Iran, and that's quite a difficult question, even though Iran follows a policy where it's trying to facilitate the purchases, but as you know, there is a political issue that is quite important and cannot be sort of left aside, which determines to a large extent the nature, the content, and the level of the relations that the European Union would have with Iran. When we talk about natural gas, which is another energy source for Europe and the European Union, there comes one state, and that's Russia. And you know very well that Russia is using its energy potential, and there is an energy potential, to reassert and consolidate its position in international affairs. So that's a very good question to always keep in mind. And then you have another sector where the European Union is trying to invest, and that's the renewables, the so-called renewables, the renewable energy sources. But there, even if we have beautiful plans in paper, we have a problem that the famous President of the United States, George Washington, had codified with 2 words when he was asked what's happening with at that time with the United States Congress as regards issuing money. He said, well, there's no money. So the European Union is found in a difficult situation that it does not dispose of all the investment means to give a big push to different aspects of renewable energy resources, even though, as I said, the plans that exist are in my view, magnificent. Now, how energy affects at this moment and what can be done in transatlantic relations. I think there is a difference of opinion between the European Union, or to be more precise, some states of the European Union and the United States as regards the dependency question. That is to say, the United States is not very happy, to say things simply, with the fact that the European Union is so dependent to Russia for at least the natural gas supplies. That's logical, but at the same time, it raises some interesting questions, I think. The first question is, what's the alternative? When there is a problem, as I said, in figures, the dependency issue would go from between 70 and 80% of energy supplies. That's a lot. If one counts and breaks it down to the 28 member states. There, the United States has presented through the public appearances and participations in conferences of an ambassador under the name of Morningstar, who is the ambassador at the State Department at this moment, responsible for the United States energy policy abroad. Mr. Morningstar was in Athens a couple of weeks ago, and in a very clear and succinct presentation, he presented the alternative. I think I didn't find a better codification of this alternative, and therefore I would refer to it. He spoke about two things. The one angle is what you would call diversification of sources, of energy sources. What do we have in mind when we use diversification of sources? First, it's the Caspian Sea resources. I would add, and I think everybody adds now, the new developments in the southern part of the Mediterranean, which is, you want to call it a triangle, you want to call it a straight line, between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, where between Israel and Cyprus it's already public, and there is a lot. I mean, the natural gas resources there are of unexpected magnitude. Greece has recently published the procedures for foreign companies to do the research, because we have very clear indications that there are resources there, and therefore we would like to open them up, so to speak, and I think that would be important for not only for the countries involved, not only for the area, but for the whole of the European Union. So this covers, these two examples cover the diversification of sources element. Then we have another one which is equally important and equally complicated. That's the second angle, and that's diversification of roots. And this is quite an interesting question, because it brings up the issue, the core issue in this project is the pipeline diplomacy. I call it pipeline diplomacy because I like to see the Pacific side of it. But others might say it's a pipeline war. And obviously, at this moment, there are a lot of pipeline projects in the European continent. I'm sure you have all heard, if I have to put it geographically, basically we have two corridors. The one is the northern corridor, it's up north, and then of course it's the southern corridor that has been more popular, according to what Ambassador Morningstar said, is more popular here in the United States. Now, the North Corridor has one main issue, and that is it takes basically natural gas resources from Russia, that's the so-called Nord Stream pipeline, and takes them directly to Germany, a question that leaves Ukraine out. And I think that was done on purpose after the 2009 crisis with Ukraine, where there was a big battle, particularly between Russia and the Ukrainian authorities for the crossing of the pipeline and the gas resources. And I think countries like Germany have decided that they no longer want to go through this again, and so they applauded for the Nord Stream pipeline project. Then, if we forget the Russian resources and we go to the Caspian, that goes through the southern corridor. But then we have one project that I'm sure you all know and heard, that is the Nabucco Project, which is a very expensive one, and it doesn't work yet because we had a lot of resistance at different countries. I think the project is important. I still have here with me letters that I have received while being in the Parliament to help and to sort of facilitate things for the Nabucco project. In there, you have other projects that like to pick from parts of the Nabucco project that are already there, and there's one that the British corporation BP set forth, and that was the SEEP pipeline. And then, of course, we go further down, and there you have the ones with Greece and Turkey, and now probably new ones that should be developed from Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and up. I need to underline one thing. When we talk about the exploitation of the Caspian Sea natural gas resources, we first have in mind the resources of Azerbaijan, and that's the Shah Deniz oil field. But I must tell you, inasmuch as these resources are important, that if we want to have an efficient, long-term flow of natural gas, Azerbaijan by itself is not enough. We need the resources of Turkmenistan, which is on the other side of the Caspian, and there we have to make sure that we resolve questions, because in the Caspian Sea, okay, you have Azerbaijan, you have Turkmenistan, but you also have Russia and Iran. So, for example, legal issues that have to do with pipelines need to be resolved. I think having negotiated treaties, it takes an effort, but it's a worthwhile effort. And it's the same thing as regards whatever in terms of pipelines is going to be set forth as a proposition for Israel, Cyprus, Greece, where I think the most important issue is to see the application of the law of the sea as it's been decided in the conference on the law of the sea that you all know. We need not to leave things unanswered, because I think it's very important, and all countries, Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, have adhered to the Treaty on the Law of the Sea, and they would like to follow that. I would say that being the main position of the United States, and that's my third proposition, there is one element that needs to couple that. And that element is the answer to the question, to what extent the United States would be ready not only to support these projects, that, from what I have seen, I take it almost as a given, but also to invest for projects of this type. And I must tell you that at this moment, particularly at the southern level, of course there are American companies, at least one of them is involved in the Israel-Cyprus part and has expressed interest for the Greek part as well, and that's Noble Energy. But what I'm referring to is an investment that would not only be investment to the core issue, which is finding out how much natural gas exists and how do we transport this to the European Union, but also to projects that are around that circle. To give you an example, in Greece we have one company which is a state or semi-state corporation that's called DEPA, and it's the company that's responsible for the administration of the natural gas resources. Greece, because of the crisis, is now in the process of privatizing, and certainly that corporation is in the privatization scheme. I was thinking that in the proposals in this privatization effort, we would have had an American proposal, which so far we haven't. But we do have a Russian one. Now, I would think that for the United States, in order to see its position, which, as I said, I find it important, the diversification of sources and routes is an important proposition as regards energy, and obviously, if we talk about other things, not only. But at the same time, I think that this can be or should be supported not only by the political framework, by the legal support all these projects need, by the, so to speak, diplomatic support, but also by investments, because this is quite important in the area of Southern Europe primarily. I think the resources exist, therefore the investments would find good ground. Finally, I would say that transatlantic relations and energy in its reconstruction, so to speak, role will certainly evolve. I think that strengthening through reconstruction and by the addition of new elements and new factors in transatlantic relations is something very important and necessary. Because in this changing world, these relations constitute not only a set of principles, not only a set of policies, but also what I would call an important tool for conduct in international relations. And with that, I'll thank you for your patience, and I'll be here. I'm ready to answer questions on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating survey of broad sense of the transatlantic relationship, and really a call for a redefinition or a re-emphasizing of the relationship with very much a focus on energy. Now, energy has been part of the transatlantic relationship. There's, of course, the U.S.-EU Council on Energy, and I wonder if you could, just to push you a little bit on this. I mean, this seems to me as a rather provocative and pioneering approach to reassessing and re-energizing the transatlantic relationship. Could you talk, I'd like you to push a little bit on this and talk a little bit how beyond what is being done already on a good number of these issues, could you just talk a little bit more about how do you see energy as really the core of the relationship? Push you on that a little bit, going beyond what has been done already. I mean, some of the things that you mentioned, are in the works as it is. So to push you a little bit on that, to make it a little bit more pointed of how you really see there, see a whole new level or a whole new definition of the relationship.
Okay. Well, thank you for your words and the question. Well, first of all, I think since you underlined it, as regards the European Union and the United States, there's a framework, and that's the framework agreement, which of course covers more than one issues. And the reason I underline the framework agreement is because it's a lot more than a bilateral agreement that could be signed between countries among themselves or between the Union and countries. Secondly, obviously there are a number of things done, but it's not over, and I would also say that it's an experimental. At this moment, I think it's like both sides experimenting on how energy as a chapter and as an issue can be the future or the force that would be pushing things forward. I would say the following. Number one, we need to sort of streamline, if you wish, the question of sources, of energy sources. And I think that would be an important question that both the United States and the European Union can do without real difficulty. As I said, I gave the example of the Caspian Sea resources. This has been something that in the European Union had been developed. At least I remember when I was first elected, one of the first opinions that I had to write was on the relationship between the European Union and the Caucasus region. But at the same time, because of the issues that are there involved, I think the United States and the European Union would have to streamline and say, all right, we have this area this area, this area. How do we treat each one of them? We need to get to an agreement of how do we do it. Because one of the aspects of transatlantic relations, which the United States has rightly proposed in the past for other questions, is the complementary nature of those relations. That is to say, when we were dealing, for example, with hardcore issues in the Middle East, and I'm referring to the peace process, in its, even now, but also in its original stages, the United States had introduced the notion of complementary approaches, and this was something that was accepted to some, rejected by others in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. But the complementarity element is there, and it's quite important. So that would be the first thing as regards the sources. The second thing, I think that we need a little more work, and the reason I say that is because there are certain levels of speed, if you wish, that things go. I think, as I said, we need a little more work as regards the different chapters. For example, I said, and I tried to outline a bit the nuclear issue. I know very well that in the United States, inasmuch as there have been cases that had particular importance, I tell you that as a student here in Washington, I lived the 3 Mile Island at that time question, and I participated in some of the sort of public debates. In Europe, things have not moved that fast. It was basically the Green parties, particularly the Green Party in Germany, that started sort of pushing towards one direction. Now, I am sure that the complementarity attitude could take us down to a code of conduct as regards nuclear energy. Second issue that I think is very important, and I know the United States has been moving fast, is the question of nuclear wastes. Because as you have newer generations and more advanced generations of nuclear plants and nuclear technology, I think that the question of wastes goes along, and I think that would be an important issue that Europe and the United States could get together. Thirdly, and I hope that with that I sort of accepted the pushing element that you have said, security of energy resources. That is crucial. And that is crucial, why? Because it involves both technological, political, and diplomatic skills. And again, I think that with the complementarity attitude and sharing experiences that exist on both sides of the Atlantic, we could get up to a level where, for example, agreements with transit countries, fortification of routes, which has been an issue in the past, I think that can be secured.
Thank you. There are lots of other issues on the table that you mentioned in your talk, but or did not mention. I welcome your questions and comments. Who would like to start? We'll go over here and then over there. If you could please just state your name. Microphone's coming.
Thank you. My name is John Alexiou. I'm a business consultant. And in business consulting, we look at the competitiveness of nations as well as large corporations. I have couple of notes here. Have most of the European Union competitiveness lost their edge? Have decades of government dependency drained these nations of the ability to innovate and grow? And finally, how we can make the governments of the European Union efficient and increase the competitiveness of all European nations which are in trouble. Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and otherwise they will not be able to manage. They have a management problem right there and a routing problem as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your question. Obviously, I don't get very happy when I have to talk about competitiveness at the European Union level, and I'm sure you can understand that. I mean, if there is one question that has been dominating at least the 15 years that I've served as an elected deputy at the European Parliament, that was, among others, but a core question was the issue of competitiveness. I think that we approach the question of competitiveness in a narrow way. Because as you know, one of the bases of competitiveness, or one of the tools for competitiveness, is investment, right? And I think the European Union, in the issues of investment, takes what I would call, in order to be a little bit sort of peaceful and cooperative, takes a non-dynamic attitude. To give you an example, you spoke very correctly, I think, of the countries that are faced with a serious economic problem. If we go to the roots of this problem, obviously it's that some of them, mine included, haven't done their homework, perhaps, as they should have done. But also, one other reason is that when you look into the recipes, quote unquote, offered by the European Union to get out of the crisis, or at least to bring things at a more acceptable level, you see a plan that has two chapters. One is what you call development, and there is investment, and there is competitiveness, and the other one is what you call, or at least what we call in our everyday discussions, horizontal cuts. And that is something that is non-dynamic in the sense you say reduce spending, reduce salaries, pensions, etc. Now, at this moment, in some of the countries that you outlined, we are only in the second one. You only have horizontal cuts. You have no development projects. And the sad thing about it is that if you look back into consecutive European Union budgets, you will see that funds for development, for competitiveness, for investment, and so on and so forth, were appropriated. So I would say that we need to change, as a European Union, I speak first, our attitude, and we need to reorganize the financial cycle, because if we don't do that, the issue of competitiveness will stay where it is now. And as I said, I'm not happy at all. I'm just, I can't be more honest. I'm not happy because it's missing. And of course, it could be, to at least defend, so to speak, my thesis statement in this discussion, it could be a good issue in transatlantic relations. How do you go about steering up competitiveness, and how do you go about using existing tools that perhaps need to be readjusted to get there?
Thank you. Over here.
Taryn Udis, a retired lawyer from the legal department of the World Bank. I testified at the European Parliament on May 25th about an issue in the transatlantic relationship. I have a nuts and bolts question. As a lawyer, we're always interested in institutions. If you had a very difficult issue, whatever the issue is, how would you go about having the transatlantic dialogue? Would you concentrate on the Parliament in the EU? Would you concentrate on the Council of Europe? Would you involve NATO? How would you get these various organs in sync? And then looking at it from the other side, the U.S. Congress, the executive, the states, and in trying to wrestle with the issue that I'm not going to bore everybody about, one of the institutions that was not functional was the press.
Yeah.
And the citizenry was completely decoupled from the resolution of the problem. So my thesis is, how do we retool the dialogue to involve the citizens?
I thank you very much for the question, and obviously, as I was preparing myself to be here, I spent a lot of time in trying to codify decision making, which is I think the core of your question, in the sense that there are certain differences in the organization, the institutional organization, between the United States and the European Union. I must say that the real problem of the European Union as regards its institutional arrangement and organization at this moment is that the European Union started as an horizontal union of states where governments had the say, and along the years tried to become vertical, which vertical is the structure of a federal state like the United States or any other national state in the world system. Now, what have we done so far? First of all, we have tried to upgrade, if you wish, the legislative part. And we have tried to develop very strongly relations between the European Parliament and the United States Congress, apart from encouraging relations between national parliaments and the United States Congress. That is to say, we have two levels. One level is at European Union institutions, the European Parliament on the one side and the United States Congress on the other. And then, when you go to state level, member states, we have encouragement of relations between national parliaments and the United States Congress. You would ask me, why would you do that? And we would do that because after the Treaty of Lisbon, which is was the latest development, the role of national parliaments in the European process has increased. So, for example, if the United States Congress has an issue, or if the United States has an issue that goes through the legislative and is addressed by the United States Congress and the European Parliament, in order to have a flow of the procedures, it would be good to secure the accord, if you wish, of national parliaments that, by virtue of the new situation, they could block it. So you see, it's like, I think, like two levels on the one side, and I would say the United States Congress. I could find a little parallel, two levels on the other side, those being the House and the Senate and the procedures needed. It's not exactly the same, but the second question, governments. There you have a problem. That's clear. Why? Because here you have the federal government, the President of the United States and the President's Cabinet. At the level of the European Union, you have the Council, which are heads of state, prime ministers, and ministers depending on the issue discussed. But the Council has not only the role of the executive, it can sometimes legislate. And therefore, you get into a little bit of, moving sand, because if the issue you want to address, it's in between, then you find yourself in a difficult situation as regards to the relationship between the European Parliament and the Council. Now, I, as Vice President, I was head of a delegation of the European Parliament that negotiated with the Council all sorts of questions, directives, laws, etc., treaties, and all that. And I can tell you, it wasn't a funny exercise. I mean, sometimes you would say, why can't we just move? And also, when you're talking about the executive, you have the European Commission. And the European Commission may seem a little bit more bureaucratic, but it has one important tool, and that is the right of initiative. It proposes the policy. So, if I had to resolve an issue, speaking as a lawyer, what I would do is I would adopt a strategy that would get me to all the institutions that are involved in the decision making. I will give you one example that we have done that in the past. I'm sure you remember the treaty, European Union, United States on extradition, which was a hot issue. What we did was we had the views of the United States as regards the treaty, and we took them around in all the institutions, seeking for at least an accord at the bottom line. So when we got into the table to sign the treaty, things were pretty much resolved, because the question, of course, is not, as you know very well, is not just simply signing the document, is also seeing how this is implemented and what's going to happen if something goes wrong or if there is a difference of opinion. I do admit that even the Lisbon Treaty did not resolve the institutional clarity that is necessary for the success, I would say implementation, and the success of framework agreements such as the European Union, United States Framework Agreement, and so on and so forth, unfortunately. I worked for a constitution. I was among the members who pushed for a European constitution, hoping that a constitution would clarify all these questions and at the same time would be very clear as regards the notion that I know has been addressed in the past in the United States, the question of shared responsibilities between the federal government and the governments of states. So what we wanted to do, and I just used exactly what I told you, I told you in the Convention for the Constitution. I said the United States, I think it was during the Nixon administration, introduced the doctrine of shared responsibility, which further clarified the relations between the federal government and the governments of states. So maybe we should do the same, clarify relations between, or competences between what is the European Union institutionally and what are the national governments. And there, of course, you have quite an interesting situation because there are very few governments that want to cede power. I mean, we are talking about tiny little levels of ceding power to the European Union at the level of 10%, and you have a war. It's not like here. But this is an issue. Yes, of course.
Thank you. Over there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Julian with Chinese Embassy. I've got two questions. First, what is Americans' response to the introduction of energy element into the transatlantic relations? My second question is, what kind of impact does Americans' pivot to Asia strategy has on transatlantic relations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think that the United States is not that it does not consider energy as an important chapter of transatlantic relations. I think the issue is perhaps more diplomatic, financial, and procedural, the word taken in its politico-economic sense. Second, I think that the diversity of energy sources is not limited to the areas that I mentioned. It's much more open. The question is to have a proposition. Secondly, to know how do you go about securing that the content of this proposition goes through. And thirdly, how do you fortify that proposition? Now, Asia, for Europe is important, of course. It's very important. But I think that if I look into, if I go back into my experience and if I look into the relevant documentation, I must admit that for a certain period of time, Asia was, on the side of the European Union, perceived more as an energy market, you know. It is lately that things are changing in the sense that Asian countries, starting with China and going down, are putting up more clearly the issue of energy resources. I've a lot of literature, and we had quite interesting discussions in different committees about, you know, construction of dams and all that in China, for example, or nuclear questions in Japan. But I think that for a certain period of time, in the eyes of Europe, I'm not saying that this is right, I'm just saying what was the case. Asia as a whole, as a subcontinent, was perceived more in terms of market, consumption, and not that much as producing force which would easily reach Europe. This is changing now, and I think it's changing because the main actors in the Asian environment, China, Japan, Korea, etc., are putting more forward capacities, and I think that's important. I'm telling you, in the European Union in the past, that was not the case. It's unfortunate because there's a world, and I think it's very important. But in the past, for all these reasons, it was not as clear as it is becoming now, and I think it will further continue. And at the same time, we have a common denominator, and the common denominator is the United States has a long tradition in relations with different countries in Asia, which is a very rich tradition, starting from the past, going through different ups and downs, okay, but it's a very rich tradition. The European Union has had, at the level of member states, a tradition or a history of relations with the Asian continent. So therefore, this common denominator can bring all three in the table, and approaching it from transatlantic relations, it certainly could be an issue, or another issue, if you wish, of convergence.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so let's take a couple final questions. We'll start over here and then maybe work our way around the table and then give you a final chance to respond. So,
I'm Sergeant. I'm from Macedonian Embassy. And I would like to thank you for your nice energy security and everything. And my question is, you talked very much about the transatlantic relations, how important are they? And there is one tool which US Greece has used against Macedonia for blocking of integration of Macedonia into NATO. The same tool was used by Cyprus to blockade Turkey into continuation of the talks about EU membership. And the same tool now is hitting you specifically when you do the search in the Israel, Cyprus, and Greece for the energy sources in the Mediterranean Sea. To what extent you are ready to change, since we are talking about the change?
okay, hold on. Go ahead. Right here.
Thanks. Piotr Krasicki, I'm currently a research scholar here. I'm curious to what extent you put any stock in American investment in exploration of energy alternatives in the actual territory of the European Union. So, for example, there's been talk in Poland now for several years, and actually I've heard a lot of talk recently coming out of the American embassy in Warsaw about American private investors in geological exploration on Polish soil. I'm just curious what the perspective is on that from Brussels. Thanks.
Thank you. And then there was one question over here. Okay.
My name is Sarah Bonfour from the Public International Law and Policy Group. I'm stepping back from the energy sector to broader issues. Sunday is election day in Greece, but also in France with the second round of the presidential elections. And there have been a lot of articles about how this could potentially affect transatlantic relations. So I would love to hear your views on possible changes. Thank you.
Good. That'll be it.
Okay. I'll try to. I mean, each one of the questions is a master's thesis.
We have 5 minutes.
No,
we have 5
okay,
minutes.
I'll do it very fast. I would start with the last one, not for any other reason, but we always reverse the order. I think, obviously, the question of transatlantic relations, I don't think it will be affected to the level that this has been presented by the press and debates. Because I think that political parties in France, to begin with their difference, are conscious of the importance of transatlantic relations, and therefore I think that no matter what has been said during the campaign, the core of the relation will not be affected. Obviously, if you look at the two candidates, one of them appears to be more extrovert, but on the other hand, I wouldn't like to follow, if you want, or subscribe to arguments that I have also read in the press, that everybody's looking like this and what's going to happen. I think there is consciousness clear enough on both parties both candidates that are competing, that transatlantic relations, and the role of France in transatlantic relations is there. Therefore, as regards Greece, I think the way the polls indicate, we would probably have a coalition government by the two major parties, and therefore I think they both have an agreement there, and I don't think that this is going to upset transatlantic relations. Obviously, not to leave it unanswered, it's a logical question every time there is an election, and particularly now that elections take place under the umbrella of a crisis, that everybody is looking. The issue of investment, I don't exclude investment in the European quote-unquote territory. In fact, I think it's a good question, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of Poland, because not only of the country, I visited Poland a couple of times, but also because of its geographic position. So when you are trying to create, you know, these entries and et cetera, that is very important. So I would be happy, and I think, if you wish, if Poland comes or insists to be more correct in its investment projects, I think the Union should push forward. Just to give you a little detail, when I was doing the opinions on energy, the president of the Foreign Affairs Committee was a Polish deputy, and he wrote a report on the necessity for a European energy foreign policy, and I did the opinion on that. So, I mean, I think there is already grounds. Now, finally, I think that the question of NATO is there because we have a real disagreement, and I think that disagreement is the only issue that divides the two countries. Obviously, from the moment that the decision in NATO was taken, there were court procedures at the International Court of Justice. I'm sure you are aware of them. And you know that the decision of the International Court of Justice sets a framework because it's added to what had been agreed and had been discussed to this moment. I will tell you, you're asking me if I'm going to change. You know that this is a crucial issue for both. So I will reverse the question. Are you going to change? Thank you.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Let's give a round of applause and thanks for